Well, let's go ahead and jump in here. Goodness, it's been a couple of weeks ago now that we started looking at, we've been doing this church history thing for quite a while. We looked at it last spring and then took a long break and then started it up again. But now we're looking a couple weeks ago at the church in the New World, of the gospel, the church, not always the gospel, because sometimes the movement of the church into the New World wasn't a good thing. And we looked at first of all, we looked at the church spreading into Central and South America, mostly Catholicism, and that was not mostly a good thing. But then we looked at the Puritans and their founding of the colony in Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And that was that was pretty much a good thing, at least at first. They founded, we looked at some of the myths surrounding that. It wasn't really freedom of religion. They were under persecution in England, and they came over to found their own religion. They want everybody to have freedom. They wanted freedom for their religion. But then, as time went on, what we're going to look at tonight is, hopefully we'll get to quite a few things, but kind of the beginning of the downgrade is what it's often called, in the passion of the Puritans, and how things went south and then how they got a little bit better. We'll start out, and I've got to hit this with a lick and a promise. Unfortunately, I cannot give a lot of detail on this, but it's called the halfway covenant. Was the primary thing that caused problems. The halfway covenant. The Puritans had a problem. Now, they still practiced infant baptism. The early Puritans, thanks, Jen. The early Puritans had a rule that you could not have your infants baptized unless you gave strong evidence of conversion yourself. Unless your life and your testimony evidence that you knew Jesus Christ, your children couldn't be baptized. What happened was the early Puritans that came over pretty much were believers. But a lot of times the children that they raised gave no evidence of conversion. They raised another generation. That happens a lot of times, the next generation, the second, the third generation. They didn't have that evidence of conversion. They didn't testify to their faith. They sort of grew up assuming they were Christians because their parents were Christians, they were in a Christian community. They had no evidence of conversion, and then they had children. So what were they going to do? They needed to baptize their children because, you had to be baptized to be saved. It was that's kind of what they came to believe. And as I said, only the children of the clearly redeemed, those who gave clear evidence, could be baptized. So they devised this, what was called the halfway covenant. And basically it was if you had loose ties to the church, if your grandparents, if your parents, if there were ties to the church, you could go ahead and baptize children. Now, you've got children who are baptized who basically no ties to the church at all. But back then, it was a big thing, and it created a lot of conflict. There were pastors who stood strong against the halfway covenant, and there were those who gave into it, and that created a lot of problems. There was also developed in the Puritan areas tremendous hysteria, religious hysteria, that was a reaction against some of as the church became more spiritually cold and more worldliness developed, there was some hysteria that developed. As religious people lose control, some will overreact with hysteria. And this happened And I think once I name the town this happened in, you're going to know where I'm going with this. This happened in a town called Salem, Massachusetts. Boom, we all know where we're going with this, right? There's been a lot of mythology about the Salem witch hunts, the Salem witch trials. But the facts are that a young girl in Salem, Massachusetts was accused of witchcraft. People were accused of witchcraft all the time. But as the culture was sliding away from faith, all of a sudden then there was this, we've got to protect our young people from drifting away, and there was this sort of hysteria among some of the more religious people. And you've got to remember, this whole group of people did not believe in religious freedom. They believed in religious coercion, they brought that over from Europe with them. And so she charged her friends. She said, well, we were led into witchcraft. She blamed others, a group of older women. And there was this mass hysteria that reigned. And it was kind of like the McCarthyism, back 75, 80 years, when was McCarthyism? The 50s? Was that the 50s? If you wanted to get out of it, you had to blame someone else. You had to say, I'm sorry, and then pin it on someone else, and then you could get out of it. 50 people, mostly women, 50 people repented of their witchcraft, but 19 said, I didn't do anything. They refused to repent, and so they were hanged. The idea that they were burned at the stake, which is the common mythology, they weren't burned at the stake. I think there was one person who was burned at the stake, but mostly burning at the stake was a European thing. They were hanged, and one man was tortured to death for refusing to give evidence against his wife. So basically 20 people were put to death. Most of them just informed on somebody else. But what happened was that as generations went on, remember the Puritans started coming over, wasn't it 16, I didn't write that, well, this is 1692 when this has happened, but the Puritans had come over the early wasn't it 1620 when they first came over? So this has kind of gone, it's been several generations. And the fervor of the Puritans was gradually replaced by what one observer called a deep sleep of religion. By the early 1700s, America, the early 1600s, the people that had come over to America were largely passionately religious. Now, we would not agree with all of their religion, but it was passionate. They were fervent in their faith. 100 years later, America, the colonies, I say America, it wasn't a country yet, but the colonies were spiritually cold, probably worse than it is today. Finding vibrant Christian faith was just hard to find anywhere. It was cold and dead. There were two key factors in this, and they're really kind of hand in hand. The first, did someone start to ask a question? Okay. And if you're welcome to ask questions or give. But the first of this, the first key was the Enlightenment, which the Enlightenment here was not God enlightening us through the Word of God, but scientific enlightenment. And what happened as people really began to delve into science, they began to answer questions that had always been considered matters of faith. These things that had been mysteries all of a sudden were being solved. And there began to be an era of excessive optimism about science. Now, 300 years later, They still haven't solved. We realize that science can answer some things, they still can't answer everything. And so we know that science has value, but it has limits. Not everybody, will agree to that, but back then they thought, well, science is going to answer all the questions. And we know it's not going to. It can't answer all the questions. But there was this excessive optimism. Why do we need religion? Why do we need God? Why do we need the Bible if we've got science to tell us the truth about everything? And so a lot of people were abandoning biblical revelation as a source of truth and just accepting we just need rationalism, we need human reason, we need science, we need intellect. And that was kind of what the Enlightenment was feeding into. There were a lot of big scientific discoveries taking place. The second aspect, and this really ran hand in hand with this, but it was deism. Now, we'll say more about this as we go on, but deism essentially is a belief in a God who started the universe. It's kind of like a God who created the mechanism but doesn't operate it. God who put the universe and endowed it with natural laws by which it's governed, but doesn't interfere in the world. Somebody made this watch, but doesn't operate it. I operate, I charge it. That's the kind of God that the deist has. And so deism basically took over the colonies. It was the predominant faith in the early part of the 1700s. It was a growing religion. The idea that that God is, that there is a God, but He's out there. He's not intervening. He's not doing miracles. He's not answering prayer. He's not speaking to people. They didn't believe. Men like Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was a deist, and he went through and wrote his own Bible. He didn't write a Bible. He just called out, and all he did was he took basically everything in the Bible that was miraculous, he threw it out. And he just went through and got sort of Jesus' moral teachings that he thought were okay. His Bible was maybe 8 pages long. I'm exaggerating, but he just picked out what he thought were the worthwhile moral teachings of Jesus. And so deism, nothing miraculous, nothing spiritual. It was all rational. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. They're really cool with that. But Benjamin Franklin was a deist. Those kinds of guys, and we'll say more about this either this week or next week, depending on how fast I move through this. But there was no spiritual passion. Churches were empty. It was worse than COVID. It just emptied churches. Now, here's something that could be controversial. The Masonic Brotherhood was actually a deist organization that grew. Now, the Masonic Lodge today is more of an honorary social club. Now, there are some Christians who are, if you're part of the Masonic Temple, you should be kicked out of a church and you can't be a Christian or a Mason. I never have been part of a Masonic Lodge. I don't even know if anyone in this church is Masonic. I don't know about it. But I think today the Masonic Lodge is a little bit more of just sort of a good works club and like a Kiwanis or something like that. But back then it was actually a deist religion, and it was much more important in people's lives. And it was very much a brotherhood, and it was very active in early America. You see Masonic. It's a little bit overblown in those national, what are those movies with Nicolas Cage, national treasure movies, where they're, finding all the Masonic. That's kind of overblown, but the fact is they were involved in laying out the architecture of a lot of things in America, and they were Unitarian. They the Unitarians were gradually replacing Trinitarian. The Trinitarian, one God and three persons. Unitarian is just one God. They rejected Trinitarianism. And Deism was very much rejecting, they were very, very much a part of that. The deists just believed in God, and they didn't care, which God, a lot of times, whatever God you worship. But that was spreading rapidly throughout. Churches were leaving behind Trinitarian, Puritan, passionate worship, and they were embracing a sort of a deistic, Unitarian worship that was, and it was, biblical Christianity was under serious threat. Passion was down. There was high immorality, and the passion and vision that the Puritans had brought with them was just about gone. I mean, it was almost completely gone. And then everything changed. It is interesting, if you had looked at the spiritual and moral condition of the colonies in the early 1730s and said that we would have an argument. Now, there is an argument as to whether or not America was established as a Christian nation. And we'll talk more about that as we move on. But if there had ever been a discussion as to whether America was a Christian nation, you would have said, well, no, this is going to be a pagan, rationalistic, deistic, Enlightenment-based nation. Christianity is a thing of the past in this nation. Whatever nation forms here Christianity is a total thing of the past. And then came, in the mid-1730s, the Great Awakening. And it was the most dramatic revival, probably, in history. We're going to talk about that. And it deserves probably 2 weeks of lessons. But I'm going to talk about it in about 15 minutes, unless you get me talking more about it. But God awakened a spirit, or it's called an awakening because it was just like a miraculous awakening. There were a series of things and a series of people that were involved, and let me run through them. First of all, the most famous one, of course, is Jonathan Edwards, and that was really the trigger point of the Great Awakening. In 1734 in Northampton, Massachusetts. I have read his autobiography. Really what it is a letter that he wrote to someone explaining. He was called on the carpet because some spiritual manifestations happened. They were really enthusiastic in Northampton after the awakening. They were like, people were enthusiastic. And people were criticizing him because people were enjoying their worship. They were enthusiastic about the Lord, and so he was getting flack. And so he wrote a letter to someone explaining what happened, and I've read that, and it's really fascinating. I think I've shared this. I don't want to take a lot of time on this, but one girl who he called a company keeper. I don't completely know what that means, but I think it meant she had a bad reputation. She was a bad girl. And there was a young man who had a farming accident and was killed in the community. And it devastated them when the farming accident took place. And this girl was converted. He had preached in that church for 17 years, and he said nobody was converted in 17 years. Wow. Nobody. And maybe he was, preachers tend to exaggerate, but he said nobody. No result, no reaction for 17 years. And then she was saved, visibly, completely saved. And he said one by one. And then after the course of a couple of years, he said essentially everybody in town, it was a town of about 600, but everybody was saved. Everybody in the town. I saw one thing that said it was more like 300 people, but he said essentially everybody was saved. And the whole town was converted. And then the revival began to spread. And it went through the colonies. And let's talk a little bit more about how it worked. Now, it's interesting. because Jonathan Edwards was a hardcore, 5-point Calvinist. He used to read his sermons, lengthy sermons, all of that. Now, it shows how God works with all kinds of different Christians. The other work was through pietists in Europe. Now, they weren't exactly that way, but we would today call them charismatics. They were enthusiastic. They were all about their feelings. They personal, spiritual passion. They would intensely meditate on the Word of God. And it was much more of a feel. He would read these intense, long sermons, almost in a monotone, deep theological treatises. The pietists were all about their feelings. So it was completely Edwards is way over here on the spectrum, and the pietists are way over here on the spectrum. And they're sometimes prone to a little bit of excess spiritually. There were times when the pietists kind of got, a little bit funky with their religion. Let's put it that way. And there was this man named Count Nicholas Zinzendorf in Dresden, Germany. He got involved with the pietists. And there was a group of pietistic people called the Moravians. And in 1722, now this is 12 years before the revival in Northampton, Massachusetts. But this Moravian group, they've been persecuted mostly by Catholics, but they're in Europe and they're persecuted. And a group of them, Zinzendorf is rich, but he's known as a pietist. And so they knock on his door, and they're seeking refuge, and he lets them in. And by 1725, he's got like 100 Moravians living in his compound, and they formed a prayer meeting. And by 1727, they had formed this 24-hour-a-day prayer meeting that lasted for over 100 years. So by 1727, 7 years before the revival began in Northampton, Massachusetts, this group of Moravians at Zinzendorf, with Zinzendorf's help, began a prayer meeting 24 hours a day. Now that doesn't mean that it was a come and go thing. Nobody could pray 24 hours a day for 100 years because obviously you don't live 100 years and you can't pray 24 hours a day. But people would come and go, and they kept the prayer meeting going 24 hours a day for 100 years. And then a revival came. Now, two things about this. One, it is easy for those of us in the evangelical world to discount charismatics and people like them. Well, they're crazy, they're excessive, they're this and they're that. But they often bring a spiritual passion that those of us who are, orthodox and whatever, it's wrong. A friend of mine, a very well-known charismatic pastor, back in Cedar Rapids, Francis Frangipan, he used to say, "We need each other." He says, "You say you Baptists," I think he meant the evangelical world. He says, "You guys are really deep in the Word, and we're all like off floating in the clouds, but we kind of need to be tethered to one another. We can kind of pull you guys maybe into more passion, and you can kind of keep us anchored to the ground." He said, "If we separate into our different worlds, then we'll go floating off." This is not exactly what he said. I think it's what he meant. I'm paraphrasing. But you guys can become too staid. We can be floating off into the stratosphere. And we need each other to kind of help each other. And I think we're better when we work together. But here's the key. 7 years before the Great Awakening began in Massachusetts, a prayer movement began in Germany. And whether that's a coincidence or not, there's not a complete tie there, except there is a little bit. And I'm going to show you the tie right here. Now, it happened after the revival began. But let's talk a little bit about the Moravian movement. The Moravians who were praying for 100 years. They also sent out 300 missionaries, and they saw 3,000 converts over that 100 years. 1736, so that's 2 years after the revival's begun, they sent a band of missionaries to the colonies, a band of Moravians to the colonies. There is this terrible storm on the boat, and they all think they're going to die. People are screaming and panicking, terrified that they're going to die. These boats were not like large, these were not like the Titanic. These were these little boats, and when there was a big storm, they would rock and roll, but not with music. They were bad. And there was a young Anglican priest on there who was headed over to do mission work. He was not converted, but he noticed this group of Moravians sitting there, and they were not panicking. This group of Moravians was sitting around calmly singing the Psalms. And he said, "This was the most glorious day I have hitherto seen." That was how he wrote it down. This man's name was John Wesley. It was John Wesley. Now, this deserves more. I'm running out of time. So Wesley headed to Georgia to convert the heathen. And after 2 years, he was a total failure. So he headed back, and at some point, a Moravian shared Christ with him, and he realized how weak his answers were. So he headed back to England, and he found somebody teaching. This is so ecumenical to use a dirty word, but he's got a Moravian, he's Wesley, so all of that. And now we hear someone sharing Luther's commentary on Romans, and he described it as his heart being strangely warmed, and he trusted Christ. Now he's an Anglican, so he establishes something within the Anglican Fellowship, a series of methods to be more faithful to the Word of God, and they came to be called the Methodist Fellowship. Within the Anglicans, methods to do better, but eventually they got run out, and so they were kind of run out of the Anglican church, and they formed their own church. One Methodist was named George. This whole thing comes full circle. George Whitefield. He was a servant while he was studying at Oxford. He was a servant, and he also was a Methodist preacher under the influence of Wesley. He was powerful and effective as a preacher. And so he decided to go to the colonies to preach. And it was in response to his preaching that the revival in Northampton spread throughout all the colonies. And it became known as the Great Awakening. So the Moravians pray, and revival starts in Northampton, and then Moravians come over, and Wesley is converted, and Whitefield becomes a Methodist and comes over and spreads the revival. So you tell me if it's all coincidental or not. He and Wesley split. Here's the big circle. Wesley, of course, is Arminian, but Whitefield's a Calvinist. They split over Calvinism, and yet they said, we're not going to fight about this. We're going to maintain fellowship. We're going to walk as brothers, even though one's a Calvinist, one's an Arminian. What they really split over was slavery, because Wesley at first didn't feel this way, but came to be completely abolitionist, and Whitefield didn't think slavery was that bad. Unfortunately, Calvinists tended to be pro-slavery because they believed, well, God ordained it this way. Not all of them, but a lot of them just said, well, this is the way God ordained it back then in that day. I'm not saying that's true of all Calvinists today or anything. But here's what happened. Let me finish this up here. The awakening spread powerfully, primarily among the lower classes and in the frontier, the less well-developed areas. And many Baptist and Methodist churches were formed. This is when Baptist and Methodist churches really began to take over America. You go to rural Virginia, and there's a zillion and a half Baptist churches. North Carolina, this is when it really began to happen, because they focused on spiritual passion, conversion, those things that were part of this. And it just spread. Now, it continued until about 1750. So for 15, 16 years, guess what in the early 50s stopped the revival? The revolutionary fervor. Politics. When the church becomes political, it will always... The next great revival, well, there was another great revival right between the Revolutionary War and the Constitutional Convention, the Second Great Awakening. There was another great revival right before the Civil War, and then the Civil War. The three great revivals in American history have all been ruined by politics. I'll just tell you that. As revolutionary fervor began, political passions welled up in people's hearts, caused a real division in the church, and the church began to lose its spiritual steam. We'll look at this next week and look at how this. We'll look at how this happened. The church in the Revolutionary era. That'll be our focus. Now, I tell you what, I would have probably taken a couple of weeks, except we got next week, and then Jenny and I are going to be gone probably 2 Wednesday nights. Maybe just one, but probably 2. So, and then we're getting dangerously close to the summer months. So, any comments or questions?
I would think there's another factor in there too. I have 27 hours of intellectual history.
There you go.
So I got that.
Well, you should be.
They were very prosperous. The colonies were very, very prosperous. And anytime that you become prosperous, Jesus says it's hard for rich men to enter the kingdom of God. And I think part of I think I would make that a number 3 element, not just the deism and I would say prosperity that did much to quiet the furor, because they were desperate when they came over here. Yeah. It was a struggle to survive. Mm-hmm. But it became so prosperous that changed the way of life.
The poor church has always, and that's why, the gospel in the lower class and frontier areas spread faster than the upper class. One of the things we'll say next week is that the gospel, I teased this a little bit, is America a Christian nation or not? That's really what I'm going to address next week. And the fact is, America has always been a dually aligned nation. From the period of the colonies on, there have been 2 streams. There's been this deistic, rationalistic, secular, American dream, financial, all of that stream of rationalism and prosperity and all of that. And there has been the Christian element. And at times, revival comes and America kind of turns to Christ, and then at times that fades away and we turn to other things. And so, is America a Christian nation? Yes. Is America a Christian nation? No. it's always been sort of this dual stream where it's sort of, you know, up and down, up and down, up and down. We have much Christianity, good and bad Christianity, but we have much genuine Christianity. But we also have this other stream that generally is on top, this deistic, rationalistic, cultural, civic religion kind of thing. And then once in a while, there's this revival that comes to the foreground, and we'll maybe look at the other revivals that take place next week. I've got to quit, but
When Whitefield split with Wesley, what denomination or what type of church?
they didn't really. He never formed a church. He just preached. Whitefield never formed a church. He just preached. And then when people were converted, I think probably. You know, I don't. My understanding, I don't know that Whitefield ever. You know, he was pretty non-denominational as far as as far as my understanding goes.
But they were in awe of him.
Oh yeah.
He was one of the, Benjamin Franklin was one of the founders of the University of Pennsylvania, which is a private school and an Ivy League school. Whitefield was one of the founders of the University of Pennsylvania. So, I mean, Benjamin Franklin was willing to work together with him
Yeah.
to found the first the first graduate school in Pennsylvania.
He was an amazing guy because he had this. They said he had this booming voice. Somehow he could speak to huge crowds. Obviously, they didn't have amplification back then, and he would speak to huge crowds, and they'd all hear him. And you know, I don't know how, but they did. And he was just you know, an amazing guy. But yeah, the first Great Awakening started with Edwards, but it was from what I read, it was Whitefield that kind of he was the one that spread the fire. Edwards lit the fire. He carried it. Father, thank you for all of your truth, all of your grace, for the fact that we know that you can take a wicked nation and revive it. We, in that hope, we continue to worship you and continue to preach and proclaim in Jesus' wonderful name. Amen.